Thank you very much, Tony. So good to be back at the Advanced Apologetics Network. That has been my network, so to speak, for many years at the forum. So great to see you all. I would really have loved to be part of the network all the way through, but I'm glad I have this opportunity. We're going to talk about miracles and the well-known, world-famous critique of miracles from David Hume. So, what about miracles, and what about David Hume's critique of miracles? It's so fascinating that a book written 250 or 70 years ago, that its arguments are still discussed and that its conclusion have been so influential for our culture. Christopher Hitchens, the well-known journalist and writer and opponent of the Christian faith, one of the new atheists, he died a few years ago. He wrote in his book, God is Not Great, that David Hume wrote the last, quote, wrote the last word on the subject. So he just treats David Hume's critique of miracles as the final word on miracles. When I myself entered the university here in Sweden, in Lund, to study theology, that was just the assumption everywhere that after David Hume, it was not possible to really take the concept of miracles seriously and to study the New Testament and its testimonies about miracles, to take those testimonies seriously. So David Hume has had such an enormous influence and continues to have it. So therefore it's really adequate that we take a look at his arguments. David Hume wrote his book 1748, and that is a few decades after Isaac Newton wrote his Principia Mathematica. And of course, it was a time and a context where people were so enthusiastic about the more clockwork-like universe they had discovered, and where people have understood so much more about the regularity of nature and what we call natural laws. And it is in the aftermath of that that Hume is writing his essay on miracles. So I think the cultural background is very important if we are going to understand Hume. He's writing with the same kind of enthusiasm over the regularity of nature. And in a kind of prophecy that has to some degree been fulfilled, he says in his book, I flatter myself that I have discovered an argument which, if just, will be an everlasting check to all kinds of superstitious delition, and consequently will be useful as long as the world endures. And for a long time, it looks like this was a true prophecy, since his perspective had dominated so much. But lately, in philosophical circles, his reasoning have come into, or have been criticized. We're coming back to that soon. But before we go into Hume's critique of miracle, let's do some reflection on a Christian understanding of miracles. In a theistic worldview, in a biblical worldview, of course, God and the works of God are foundational. And in a biblical worldview, both the natural and the supernatural is related to God, is equally related to God. The natural world is created by God and upheld by God, and all the natural, what we describe as natural laws, are the works of God. his kind of indirect working through what he has created himself. And then, of course, the supernatural. So both the laws of nature and miracles are workings of God. It's just two different ways that God is working. In the more regular way, through the created order that comes from him, and then through the miraculous deeds that God has been doing in history. And of course, in a Christian worldview, miracles are absolutely foundational. Creation is a miracle. When God called this universe into being by his word, that is a miracle. And the whole salvation history there is, of course, strong miraculous elements in terms of the incarnation, the life of Christ, and his ministry and the resurrection of Christ. And we think of the future, the return of Christ, the resurrection of all humans, the creation of a new heaven and earth. So miracles are absolutely foundational. If we can't believe in miracles, we can't, of course, believe in Christianity. But what then is a miracle? Well, here is a definition that is often used. A miracle is an event where God makes a temporary exception or a temporary addition to the order of nature as a sign for us. If we try to break this up in its different parts, we can say that the miracle, it's an event, it's a temporary event. It does not interfere with the general regularity of nature, but is a temporary action from God's side. It is an exception to or an addition to what's happened in nature. It's not grounded in nature, but it happens with nature. It is an exception or an addition to the order of nature, which is of course created by God and upheld by God. And because it is an exception to or an addition to the order, the miracle is detectable for us. Because there is an order, we can see when something is added to that order and that regularity. It is God who is, the miracle is caused by God. It's an event caused by God's direct action. And it has a purpose. It is a sign that points human beings to God and to what God is up to do. So that would be the kind of basic aspects of a biblical definition of miracles. C.S. Lewis says in his book, Miracles, it is therefore inaccurate to define a miracle as something that breaks the law of nature. So it does not break the law of nature. And he continues, if God creates a miraculous spermatozoon in the body of a virgin, it does not proceed to break any laws. The laws at once take it over. Nature is ready. Pregnancy follows. According to all the normal laws, and 9 months later, a child is born. Okay, with this background, let's look at Hume's critique of miracles. And there is, I think you can say, two basic critical perspectives. And before we go into the breakout rooms, let's briefly look at the first of Hume's critiques. That is his ontological critique. Hume writes, a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. And because firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the case against the miracle is, just because it is a miracle, as complete as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined to be. So Hume has a different definition of miracle. He sees it as a violation of the laws of nature, and he describes the laws of nature as firm, and that they have been established through unalterable experience. So here it seems like Hume ontologically are excluding miracles from the beginning, that he knows on beforehand that miracles cannot happen because what we describe as laws of nature has been confirmed in this definitive ways. But here is, of course, a huge mistake. We know there's order in nature. We can describe laws of nature. But the factor we need to discuss here is not the laws of nature, but the whole issue of, is nature the only factor that is there? Or is there more than nature? Is there a supernatural reality? The scientific knowledge we have about the regularity of nature does not in itself preclude the existence of the supernatural and the possibility of God making an exception or an addition to how nature normally works. I do really like Francis Schaeffer's phrase. He often talked about one perspective on life, on the universe, is to see the universe as an open system of cause and effect. So there is cause and effect, there is system, there is laws of nature, but it is an open system, and God can interact into the system he has created and that he is upholding. So that is biblical theism. Or you can look at the universe as a closed system of cause and effect. It's a system, there's cause and effect, and it's closed. And in that kind of world, miracles cannot, of course, happen. So that is the naturalistic perspective of the universe. And David Hume seems to just assume a closed system of cause and effect. And this presupposition shapes his reasoning. He can write like this, but a dead man's coming to life would be a miracle because that has never been observed in any age or country. Are you sure? A Christian would ask. But he's just assuming that this has never happened because he knows ontologically that it cannot happen. And that is, of course, I think, his great weakness in his first critique, that he's just assuming a non-Christian view of reality. Hume's epistemological critique. Hume's next argument against miracle concerns the testimonies about miracles. We know about miracles mainly because people give a testimony. They have seen a miracle. And this is, in Hume's view, never convincing enough. And he is giving us a number of reasons why we never have reasons to believe in a testimony about miracles. So he talks about what you can call the falsehood possibility. No miracle, in his view, is supported by testimony of a sufficient number of trustworthy people to rule out the possibility of falsehood. Maybe the group is too small, they are not reliable enough, so their testimony might not be true. That is always an option. It could be a false testimony. You can talk about the wonder temptation amongst us as human beings. So many people are led into unreasonable belief because of surprise and wonder, and they are tempted to interpret things in this miraculous way, not because something has happened, but just because of the sensation and the surprise of something they experience. Thirdly, there is the question of ignorance. Hume remarks that most reports of miraculous events happens amongst what he calls barbarous and ignorant people who may not be sophisticated enough to distinguish between reality and fantasy. And so he's really looking down on a lot of people here, you can say. And fourthly, he talks about religious competition. Every religion gives miracles as a reason for the truth of that specific religion. But if there are miracles in every religion as an argument for the specific truth of that and the superiority of that religion, then all those miracle claims cancel each other out. So there is no function to it. So if you put all these things together, the possibility that the testimony is false, people are gullible and want to believe certain things, and that many people are ignorant and not sophisticated, and that all religions are making similar claims, the conclusion for Hume is this: no testimony is ever sufficient to establish a miracle, unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. So he says we have never reasons to believe in miracle, because there are no good enough testimonies. So to quote him, so you can hear his own words. For never in all of history has a miracle been attested by a sufficient number of men of such unquestioned good sense, education, and learning as to guarantee that they aren't deluded, of such undoubted integrity as to place them beyond all suspicion of wanting to deceive others, of such credit and reputation in the eyes of mankind as to have much to lose if they were found to have hold a falsehood, and at the same time testifying to events, the reported miracle, that occurred in such a public manner and in such a famous part of the world as to make the detection of any falsehood unavoidable. All these conditions must be satisfied if we are to be completely confident of the testimony of men. So he's really raising the bar really high, and at the same time making the bar very subjective. What on earth is a famous part of the world? How do you define that? Is it David Hume, Scotland, or must it happen in London, or is Jerusalem public enough? What about a sufficient number? He's not telling us. Is 500 persons enough? Or what about integrity? Is it good enough if you're willing to give your life for it? It's actually, I think, possible to take the case of the resurrection of Jesus and say, I think it looks like it passes the bar. But since he has constructed it in this way, he can always higher the bars and say, no, 500 is not enough. No, Jerusalem is not a good enough place. No. So I think he has constructed his criteria here in a wrong way. His conclusion is, therefore we may establish it as a maxim that no human testimony can have such force as to prove a miracle and make it a just foundation for any system of religion. So that is the conclusion he has been drawing, that testimonies can never establish a miracle, and therefore there is no foundation for the Christian testimony that God raised Jesus, and that cannot be the foundation for Christianity, according to David Hume. The Christian faith is, of course, built on the testimony of the first disciples. They testified that God had raised Jesus, and they gave their testimony of how Jesus appeared to them. But according to Hume, we have no reason to trust their testimony and we cannot put that as the foundation of a religion, of Christianity. This kind of reasoning has come to dominate for a very, very long time New Testament theology. And to quote just one example of a person who reasons just in the way that David Hume wants us to reason. Here is Bart Ehrman, the well-known critic of Christianity and of the New Testament. In his book, How Jesus Became God, he says, quote, "Any other scenario besides a miracle, no matter how unlikely, is more likely than the one in which a great miracle occurred, since the miracle defies all probability, or else we wouldn't call it a miracle." So he is excluding miracles as a possible explanation. What can we say about this? In terms of analyzing the probability or the trustworthiness of a testimony, all those kinds of arguments are dependent upon the background context, what kind of context you put your analysis into. And here I would say that Hume's ontological critique and his epistemological critique are merging, because if you know on beforehand that there is no possibility of miracles, then of course you will never have a testimony that is sufficiently trustworthy because of your background knowledge that miracles cannot happen. Therefore, you know on beforehand that all the testimonies must be false. And I think the ontological argument creeps into his epistemological reasoning when he is trying to analyze the value of a testimony. I think it's also important to see that if the context is not excluding a certain explanation, we are sometimes justified in believing highly improbable things if we have good evidence for it. We cannot just look at things statistically. Think, for example, about the Big Bang theory. It's a highly unlikely event that time and space, energy and matter came into being out of nothing. It's highly unlikely, and it has never happened before. It looks like a one-time event, and still the scientist tells us we have good evidence for this very unusual, and just if you look at itself, a very unlikely event. So it's important here to distinguish between adding evidences and weighing evidences. So for example, take the question of resurrection from the dead. The number of dead is much, much greater than the number of raised people from the dead. If we take raised into glory, there is only one, Jesus Christ. So the number of dead people that have not been raised into glory is much, much greater. But it's not statistics that determines the truth. It's not the majority vote that because most people have died without being raised yet, therefore Jesus must also be dead. But you have to weigh the evidence for this specific claim that this individual, Jesus of Nazareth, was raised by God into glory. So here it is a key thing to be open to investigate the evidence instead of drawing a conclusion on beforehand, because you have certain ontological principles that exclude, for example, the resurrection, or you have put up a number of epistemological criteria that that you can use in a way to exclude the resurrection. You need to be open to look into history to see, has this unusual event actually happened? You will find, of course, an analysis of Hume's critique of miracles in many apologetic books. If I should recommend one, I think I would recommend this book, In Defense of Miracles, by Douglas Guyvett and Gary Habermas. You can also find non-Christians' critique of David Hume. David Johnson, who is a Jewish philosopher, is criticizing David Hume in his book Hume, Holism and Miracles. And John Ehrman, a more well-known critique of David Hume. John Ehrman is an agnostic philosopher who critiques David Hume, showing that showing the fault of David Hume's reasoning in his book Hume's Abject Failure. Before you go out into breakout rooms, let me end by quoting from C.S. Lewis' book Miracle. Each miracle writes for us in small letters something that God has already written or will write in letters almost too large to be noticed across the whole canvas of nature. They focus at a particular point, either God's actual or his future operations on the universe. And talking about the grand miracle of the resurrection. He, Christ, has forced open a door that has been locked since the death of the first man. He has met, fought, and beaten the king of death. Everything is different because he has done so. This is the beginning of the new creation. A new chapter in cosmic history has opened. And I wanted to end with that quote, just to underline that when we discuss human miracles, it is not just a philosophical, interesting discussion about ontology and epistemology. There's a lot at stake, which Lewis so beautifully captures in this quote.